vivo contento per cruda beltà, nel ciel di bellezza s'accreschi fierezza e manchi pietà, che sempre qual scoglio all'onda d'orgoglio mia fede sarà. Nel ciel di bellezza s'accreschi fierezza e manchi pietà, che sempre qual scoglio all'onda d'orgoglio mia fede sarà.
A warm welcome to Environmental Identities number 6. I'm Hisham Khalidi, the director of the Jan van Eyck Academy. I'm very pleased and very excited to welcome Glenn Albrecht, amongst others, honorary fellow in the School of Geosciences, the University of Sydney, for his keynote lecture today, From the Age of Solastalgia to the Symbiocene, and which is moderated by our curator Bruno Alves de Almeida, and with interventions by participants Lucas Ren. Well, the Environmental Identities series is part of a larger scope of investigations into the relationship between art, design, and climate change and its effects. In a period of 10 years, we are scrutinizing the workings of the Academy and art practice in programs, lecture series, and other means. Again, I wish you a warm welcome tonight, and I'll give it to Bruno, who will further moderate tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hisham, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Bruno, as Hisham already mentioned. I'm the curator of the Jan van Eyck Academy. And I would also want to welcome you to the 6th edition of the Environmental Identity series. We just watched a short clip of the film Solastalgia, a work by artist and composer Lucas Ren, developed in collaboration with the Stuttgart State Opera. Lucas Ren, as Hisham mentioned, is the current participant of the Jan van Eyck Academy, and he'll join the conversation a bit later. Solastalgia, the title of his film, is one of the key concepts that our guest tonight, again, Glenn Albrecht, has developed, a concept that has become worldwide accepted as a key notion to the understanding of the psychosocial impacts of environmental change. So tonight, Glenn will take us from the age of Solastalgia to the Symbiocene. And for those who are not familiarized with these terms, because indeed they are new words that Glenn creates, we have made available a glossary of terms, many of them that Glenn will mention tonight. So you can have access to that glossary. If you are watching via YouTube, for example, you can go to the description of the video, and there's a link there that will send you to the Jan van Eyck website, where you can find that PDF. If you're on the Zoom, I believe there's the same link in the Q&A, or you can just simply go to the website of the Jan van Eyck, click on the page of this event tonight, and look for the link, and you can download the PDF. It might help you navigate through the many new words that Glenn has created over the past years. So Glenn, as Hisham presented, is an environmental philosopher with both theoretical and applied interests in the relationship between ecosystems and human health, broadly defined. He's an honorary fellow in the School of Geosciences, the University of Sydney, and he retired as Professor of Sustainability at Murdoch University in Perth, Western Australia. His latest book, which I have here with me, is called Earth Emotions, New Words for a New World. And you can find regularly new texts from Glenn in his blog called Psychoteoretica. So before I give the word to Glenn, I would like to ask you, following online, to leave your comments and questions either on the Zoom Q&A or on the YouTube chats, and I'll make sure some of them are addressed in our conversation afterwards. So, hi Glenn, welcome. Good morning.
Greeting. Yes, it's early morning in Australia, Eastern Australia. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to engaging with your academy and those who are listening to this podcast streaming service. So let's go.
Yes, thank you for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Right, well, I'm here to talk to you about the age of solastalgia, and my hope that we'll make a transition to what I call the Symbiocene, which is an era that I have imagined as existing in the future. And so I have to take you on a journey from one age, which we call the anthropocene, which is now, and the conditions that humans are feeling within it, take you through the anthropocene and into the Symbiocene, which I hope will be a much more enjoyable experience for you. That we are living in the Anthropocene at the moment is something that I take as partially a scientific statement that humans are the dominant change agent on the earth, and that they are influencing all of the biophysical processes that matter not only for our lives, but for all life on the planet. So we've become a dominant species, and the whole point of the Anthropocene is to try and highlight the human dominance over all other natural processes on Earth at the moment. But there's another dimension to the Anthropocene, which is that even if it's not scientifically justified to call this new era the Anthropocene, from an emotional and psychological perspective, this period of human dominance seems to be part of our psyche. It seems to be part of the human experience. The separation of humans from the rest of nature could be one of the most important aspects of defining the Anthropocene. I started thinking about the Anthropocene decades ago, and it coincides with my attempt to start to put human emotions into a connection with the state of the earth. It seemed to me that the biophysical conditions around humans is a major determinant of how they're feeling, and whether they're emotionally positive or negative is largely a result of the external environment. And yet many people could see the environment around them deteriorating, were feeling distress or even sometimes anger about that, but we didn't have a language, at least in the English language, to describe precisely those kinds of feelings. This became more obvious to me when I looked at what was happening in my own part of the world, in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales, Australia, where some of the world's largest open pit or open cut coal mining was taking place. These are massive impacts on the earth. Hundreds of square kilometres of what was formerly rolling savanna land was being dug up and exported to the rest of the world as coal. And so the impact is so great that if I now suggest that if you want to see the Anthropocene in action, all you need to do is go to the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, wind down the window of your car, fly over it, or even look at it on Google Earth, because it's so big that you can see it from space. And you will see that this transformation of the earth from what was once called the Tuscany of the South, a beautiful place even by European evaluative standards, the home of the Wanneroo people, the indigenous people of this part of Australia. It was productive, it was fertile, humans could live there and have a really good quality of life. But it was being converted bucket load by bucket load, truckload by truckload, train by train into the carbon dioxide of the world. So it was a place that was exporting greenhouse gases and importing climate change. This area is now becoming hot, so hot that it's almost unbearable to live there. And so this connection between earth distress and human distress became obvious to me by simply visiting my own part of the world, going into the outback, as it were, and discovering that the human presence was so powerful that it was transforming the earth, terraforming it into a place that was really hostile to all forms of life. If you have ever seen an open cut coal mine, it pretty much destroys the possibility of future life. it's a desolating experience from the point of view of the earth and from the point of view of the person who's unfortunate enough to witness it. So that's the starting point for my thinking about the influence of the state of the earth on the state of one's mind or the state of one's psyche. Our emotional compass is another way that I sometimes think about it. So this human distress is exemplified in all of the things that we now read about. Climate change, disease pandemics, the whole bioaccumulation of toxins and poisons, plastic pollution. I don't need to go into the details of all of that because most people who are even mildly environmentally aware know that these hugely negative events are taking place now at global scale. And that's also something new that humans in the past have been able to perhaps desolate or destroy certain small patches of the earth and then happily move on and find somewhere new that was ready to be exploited. But now that we've become a global species, we're exploiting and desolating the whole earth. And the most obvious example of that is climate warming, where there is not a single place on earth that is not being impacted right now by the anthropogenic forces of climate warming through our carbon dioxide pollution and other greenhouse gases. And so we are now experiencing the Anthropocene in our face, as you would say it in Australia. It's right in front of us. We can't ignore it. The disease pandemic, COVID-19, is also a powerful reminder that the earth and its health is crucially dependent on the relationship between humans and the wider environment. Disturbing formerly pristine areas, formerly undisturbed areas is one of the major reasons why we have the COVID-19 pandemic. And I actually wrote about the impact of SARS on the structure of cities and the shutdown of people's places. I also wrote about the impact of HIV/AIDS, the foot and mouth disease epidemic in England. This is back in the 1990s when I was just beginning to think about this impact of the state of the earth on the state of human emotions. And so it's not the first time that disease pandemics have influenced the earth, but it's certainly the case that COVID-19 is by far the most powerful and the most pervasive. So in 2003, after experiencing the Hunter Valley at its full anthropogenic force in the form of these massive open cut coal mines, massive coal-fired power stations, and the huge amount of infrastructure that's needed to generate those industries, I thought, isn't it strange that I was feeling this deep emotional disturbance about the state of the earth, but I had nothing in my English language to describe it. Distress was too general a word, and we get distressed from so many different things. And I thought at that time, earth distress is something which deserves a language of its own. And as a result of that, I began to think about, well, what kind of word would be needed to describe the distress that I'm seeing in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales. And being at university, I also had the opportunity to start asking people who lived in that area what they were feeling, and their explanations of their own distress were very similar to mine. And indeed, they all seem to have what at that point I would call earth distress, or I think my very first attempt to describe this feeling was placealgia, that there was a kind of pain or sickness associated with the place where you were living, and that was extremely distressing to you. But I didn't like that word, so I created the concept of solastalgia, which I've now become well known for. And that in 2003 was my first formal attempt to explain the distress, the emotional disturbance that I was feeling and that other people were feeling in the face of this massive environmental change in the Upper Hunter Valley. So I defined solastalgia as this emplaced or existential melancholia that people were feeling when they were directly connected to their home environment, but their home environment was changing around them in ways that they felt negative. I even had a short definition, the bumper sticker version, which is the homesickness you have when you're still at home and your home is leaving you. It's leaving in the Hunter Valley, literally. It's being dug up and exported to the rest of the world. But it's a metaphor as well, that everything that you valued, everything that you felt was good about where you lived, your sense of place and your sense of identity, the theme of this series of talks, was reinforced every day. And for people in rural and remote areas, people close to national parks and native bushland, that meant that the things that they valued, the clean water, the wildlife, particularly the bird life, the clear, wonderful starry nights where you can see the Milky Way easily, the other things like the freshness and cleanliness of the air, these things were being taken away from people who were able to take them for granted for the whole of European settlement until about the 1970s. And of course, for the indigenous Wanneroo people, that was part of their experience of being human, their sense of place, their sense of identity for tens of thousands of years. And so this process, this solastalgia, this negative transformation of your loved home place was only possible. It was a feeling that you could have only if you actually loved the place where you lived. And to have that love affair broken deserved a word of its own. And so I published in 2005 in a journal called Philosophy, Activism and Nature, my first essay about solastalgia. And in it, I was able to combine my transdisciplinary thinking, partly informed by philosophy, partly informed by sociological and social psychological and anthropological thinking, into a more considered contribution to the way we think about the environment and how we conceptualize it and how we can speak of it. Included in that essay were quotations from people that myself and my colleagues, I worked with a social psychologist, Nick Higginbotham, and an anthropologist by the name of Linda Connor. And we conducted formal research on the people of the Upper Hunter who were being affected by the coal mining, the power station fallout, the infrastructure. And we put together what I think was a very powerful and persuasive argument that not only do we need a new concept to describe our relationship to the earth when it's going bad, when it's negative, but that this is a concept that can be shared by many other people who are in similar circumstances. And so the Upper Hunter became a precursor for how we could begin to think about the negative changes to the environment and how they impact on human well-being and the human psyche in circumstances all over the world. At that time, climate change was real. It was scientifically validated. We were those people who were well informed by science were in no doubt that climate change, like coal mining, was having a massive negative effect on the earth as a whole. And that as a consequence, even in our very first publications, I was able to see that climate change was going to be one of the factors that the topic or the subject matter of solastalgia could cover. And since then, we can see that the elements of the earth, even if we just simplify it by talking about earth, wind, fire, water, every single aspect of the systems of the earth are being negatively changed by the impact of humans under what we would call the anthropocene. Fire in particular is one that people in California and Australia and many other parts of the world, I mean, I know that in Greece, Portugal, parts of Spain and France, the wildfires as a result of a dangerously warming climate, a drying climate, an extreme climate and extreme weather events, these impacts are now so huge that they can't be ignored. We're experiencing fire at Wallaby Farm, where I live in New South Wales. Last summer we had 47-degree Celsius temperatures, fire in my own area, temperatures so hot that plants were dying in the immediate environment. They didn't even need to be burnt by fire to be burnt. The ambient temperature was so hot that we were losing our vegetation. So this is now becoming so obvious to people all over the world that solastalgia is also a concept that's having relevance and has some traction with people in other parts of this of the earth. I noticed that Greta Thunberg the other day put out a statement that we are seeing these massive events like wildfire all over the earth, but people have just moved on and ignored the lessons that ought to be learnt from anthropogenic fire and its massive impacts. It's certainly the case that COVID-19 has taken the attention away from the fires of less than a year ago in Australia. But I think the impact was so great, 3 billion animals burnt in the fires, 30-odd human beings killed directly by the impacts of fire, many thousands of others impacted by smoke and the impact on their respiratory systems. I don't think the impact has been ignored, but we're now being simultaneously hit by so many negative impacts. It's hard for people to know where to look right now. If it's not fire, it's COVID. If it's not COVID, it's Trump. And so as a result, we're experiencing multiple forms of anxiety and distress all at the same time. Now, I don't know about you, but it's hard to keep all of those sources of anxiety under control at any one moment. So although I agree with Greta that it seems as if we've not learnt the lesson from things like the massive wildfires the world over, I remain hopeful that there is in fact a long-term connection between these massive disruptive forces at global scale now and our need to address the psychoterratic, the psyche earth impacts of them all. Now, solastalgia is not the only response that we can have. I've also looked at other authors and writers who have made these connections between the state of the earth and the state of the human psyche. The first one was Johannes Hofer, the Swiss doctor who came up with the concept of nostalgia, and around which I built the concept of solastalgia. Nostalgia was this homesickness that people would feel when they were absent from home but dearly wished to return. They were literally homesick. That concept became the model for how to think about the psychoterratic, because I just reversed it. Instead of you being away from home and wishing to return, solastalgia very simply is when you're at home and your home is moving away from you and you want it back. And that now I think is a very clear and distinct way of understanding the kind of pressures that we're under. Many other authors have looked at the issues in the popular literature. We have Richard Louv, who's written about nature deficit disorder as a problem where we're constantly seeing our children experiencing less and less of nature. So as a negative psychoterratic feeling, they're more or less suffering from a form of ignorance with respect to nature and life because they have no experience of it. Since the 1990s, we've been looking at anxiety in the form of eco-anxiety, and there's a big literature on eco-anxiety throughout the world. So if you're experiencing anxiety, it's the experience of something which is about to happen or might happen in the near future. Solastalgia is the direct experience of it happening in front of you. It's the lived experience of a negative transformation. I also talk about the concept of global dread, which is the anticipation of a truly dreadful apocalyptic future where you can see what's happening in the present and you project into the distant future this powerful dread. We also talk about eco-paralysis, where the information coming in about the complexity and the diversity of problems that we're feeling lead to a form of paralysis where you don't know what to do next. Changing the light bulbs just doesn't seem like an adequate response. So as a result, people just freeze. They feel as if they can't do anything. And so we can see all over the world, people are struggling with the negative impacts of the Anthropocene, and they're so powerful now that there is emerging a language, an emotional language about how to understand these negative earth emotions. And we're seeing the emergence of new terms with people are now talking about ecological grief, climate trauma, climate mourning, climate anxiety. And I can understand why it is that people are constantly coming out with ways to try and explain the nuances of our distress with respect to what is going on around us. My particular effort has been to try and create new terms because I believe many of the experiences that we have are new to humanity. As a now globalized species, we've not experienced these massive global scale changes in the past. And we actually need a new language to describe these experiences. The subtitle of my book, Earth Emotions, is New Words for a New World. And so that's in part my explanation or even justification for why it is that I am creating new terms. We're actually living at a time of transformation from the geologists and climatologists would say the Holocene, the Goldilocks period of our immediate geological past, where the climate and the conditions for the evolution of human culture, technology and industry were almost perfect. Not perfect everywhere on Earth, but we've been pretty successful as a species. But now we're seeing the collapse of the Holocene and the collapse of that period, which was incredibly generous for human enterprise and for human population growth. And so this period of the Holocene, its replacement by the Anthropocene reaching a peak of destructiveness, is where we are at the moment. And I think the famous painting of the Scream is probably one of the images that that people are now not only looking at or perceiving but feeling. That was caused by Krakatoa blowing up in the 1880s and spreading dust all over the world and brilliant blood red sunsets. And so the Scream was a response to a massive global scale event. Volcanic eruptions of that order are very rare, but we're now seeing the equivalent of the Scream happening through climate change, plastic pollution, other forms of pollution, the extinction of species. So our identity as a species is now being challenged. And it's being challenged in a way that I feel that the negative psychoterratic is obviously on the ascendancy. And we can respond to that by sitting in the corner, holding our hands over our heads and rocking back and forth. We can drink more, party harder, try our best to ignore what's going on because it's so painful and so hurtful, or we can resist it. So over the last, almost 10 years now, I've been thinking about how to resist the power of the Anthropocene. How can we get out of it? Given that we got ourselves into it, it would seem, we call ourselves Homo sapiens, wise humans, intelligent apes, whatever you want to define sapien as. If we are smart enough to get ourselves into this mess, or dumb enough, perhaps is a better way of saying it, we should be smart enough to get ourselves out of it. So I started thinking about, well, what kind of future would I like to be in? What kind of future would I like my children and grandchildren to be in? I want everyone to experience something like the Holocene, but we can't reverse the arrow of time and space. We can't go backwards. So I started to think about the opposite of the Anthropocene, and I came up with this concept of the Symbiocene. The Symbiocene comes from the term symbiosis, which is a biological term for the companionship, the living together of different species in the one time and space. Symbiosis operates at all scales, from the micro to the macro. And it's this idea of companionship, how it is that life lives with other forms of life, shares life, that is the key to the idea of the Symbiocene. The word symbiosis is derived from the Greek symbiosis, which means companionship, to live together. The symbios in Greek means to be living together. And I think the science of symbiosis is now so powerful that we understand that it is an alternative way of thinking to the nature is red in tooth and claw, struggle for existence, Darwinian, selfish view of nature, which has dominated our view of life and biology over the last few centuries. We now have a new science that's been derived mainly from the work of Lynn Margulis and other champions of the science of symbiosis. We know enough now to know that there is a scientific foundation for a vision of a future which is powerfully reconnecting humans to the rest of life. And so I started to think, well, if I can create a meme, a cultural, a form of cultural conceptual transmission that is desirable, perhaps young people and people who are suffering from eco-paralysis could get out of the Anthropocene and move into the Symbiocene as an idea, as a concept. And that we can begin to, once we have an idea of what we would like to have in the future, we can start to create it. And I think this act of creation is necessary because, as I said earlier, we can't go back to the past. So the Symbiocene becomes an era for humans where we reconnect to the essential aspects of life, that aspect of life which is unique perhaps to the planet Earth. It's so special that we haven't found it anywhere else in the cosmos or the universe, that we may in fact be the only planet that supports this amazing thing we call life. To create a culture that destroys life is inherently insane. To create a culture that lives in harmony with the rest of life as it has evolved through both Darwinian and symbiotic evolution seems to me to make a lot of sense. And so being a philosopher, I can't think of the practical aspects of the Symbiocene to any great extent, but a lot of it's just common sense. Why would you want to introduce toxic, carcinogenic, polluting items into any kind of system within which you live? Why would you not want to use freely available, non-polluting forms of energy? It's, as the Americans once said, a no-brainer. Why not use the resources of the earth which are inherently renewable and safe? We can certainly begin to think about how we can do that. Let's stop breaking or busting symbiotic connections between species that form ecosystems, that form biomes, and protect them, because it's more than just the lungs of the earth in the Amazon. This is a whole area of the earth which has biodiversity which supports the rest of life on the planet. And so I began to think about how we could conceive of this new era. And we now can make bricks out of fungi. There are people making materials out of fungi and other biological life forms. Bricks, concrete, cement are part of the problem because they are amongst the most carbon polluting substances on the planet. We can begin to think about biodegradable everything. I often illustrate the fact that we now have tableware, plates, cutlery that you can eat after you've finished your meal, or at the very least compost them. Energy, it's highly controversial, but we now think of energy as the best we've got is solar power through photovoltaics and wind power, which is itself another form of solar power. But there are guys working on bacteria, microbes that can form electricity, and they can be built into the fungi walls of a house so that living things actually produce the power that you then use in your home. The fashion industry, we now make material out of mushrooms. We have mushroom leather. And so I'm beginning to think that we actually do have the practical knowledge to create a world which is, for humans, which is intimately reconnected to the rest of life, but in a way that's an expression of Homo sapiens, our intelligence. The other benefit that we get from the Symbiocene is the expression of positive earth emotions. And so I've been working hard to expand on E.O. Wilson's concept of biophilia, or the love of life. Wilson argued that biophilia is genetic, inherent, instinctual in humans. And I've often thought that, well, I'd love that to be true, and perhaps it is, but that we need to work harder on supporting biophilia. And so I've developed new concepts on the positive side of the psychoterratic typology. The idea of ecophilia. I talk about eutierria, which sounds tricky, eu meaning good, tierra, the earth, ia on the end, a state, a feeling, a good earth feeling. Many of us get that when we're in nature, and we suddenly forget that we're a separate human identity and that we just merge with the rest of life, and it becomes a seamless experience, a spiritual experience. I talk about endemophilia, that which is distinctive, endemic to your own area of earth and that you love. Other writers have discussed topophilia, or love of place, which is obviously the opposite of solastalgia. So the meme of the Symbiocene invites us to reconnect with our positive earth emotions. And I argue that we simply cannot allow a minority of humans to dominate us to the point where all of us are beginning to experience the negative, the alges, the solastalgia, and worse. It gets worse. If I call them terraforans, earth destroyers. If they win, we're all in serious trouble. So in my book, Earth Emotions, I've invited Generation Symbiocene to take on the concept of the Symbiocene and bring it about. It's going to be mainly young people, Generation Z onwards, but it's open to anyone, including aging baby boomers who wish to give away their wealth, privilege and status to those that will come after them. I think Greta Thunberg has done a fantastic job for humanity in trying to get the baby movers to stop colonizing the future for their own children. I want to see my own children and grandchildren in the future with an unpolluted world, strong connections to nature, using technology and creativity in ways that will support the rest of life, not work against it. And so I invite all of you to join the Symbiocene. Membership is free. There is no organization that will take money from you. It's a state of mind that exists in the future. I encourage you all to go there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Glenn, for the invitation. I think a lot of people will urgently wants to go to the Symbiocene. So I'm happy that you have invited us all. It's also wonderful to see such a big and rich arch of your research for the last years. And again, I really recommend this book because it also conveys all of those personal histories and the concepts that are tied to your own life and to your lived experience. So to give you a little breathing space and time, and to welcome Lucas into the conversation, I want to show you all a second excerpt of the film Solastalgia, and then we'll continue our conversation afterwards.
Der Flughafen verwandelt aber nicht nur den Körper am Boden in einen Körper in der Luft. Der Flughafen transformiert den reisenden Körper in eine Serie von Verarbeitungskategorien. Bürger, Passagier, Fracht, Freigepäck oder Secondary Security Screening Selective. In seinen Asservatenkammern landen Körper und Körperteile seltener Tiere und Pflanzen, oft in Kapseln oder als Öle gepresst. Hier sind die Zutaten einer ganz besonderen Medizin. Teriak, aus Schlangenfleisch und Schlangengiften und allem Möglichen gemischt, wurde es als venezianischer Teriak weltberühmt. Ein Heilmittel gegen alles. Als die Pest Venedig heimsuchte und Monteverdi seines Sohns beraubte, als aller Verkehr und Handel in der Metropole zum Erliegen kamen und die Trinkhallen geschlossen wurden, rissen sich die Leute um den Stoff und die Scharlatani panschten Alternativen. Zur Qualitätssicherung übernahm der Staat die Herstellung und erfand ganz nebenbei die erste Behörde zur Medizinaufsicht. Nachweisbaren Nutzen hat das Mittel keinen, doch mit dem Gewinn ließen sich schöne Paläste bauen. Lasst uns das Mondlicht ermorden. Sie fragen, was hat das mit Ihnen zu tun? Sehen Sie sich um. Sie fühlen sich einsam. Sie haben Heimweh. Vielleicht, weil Ihr Zuhause schrecklich ist und Ihr Ankunftsort noch gar nicht existiert. Die alte Welt liegt im Sterben, die neue ist noch nicht geboren. Das ist die Zeit der Monster.
Oh
Yes, that was the second excerpt of the Solastalgia that we're showing now. Solastalgia, as I said in the beginning, is a work by artist and composer Lucas Rem, developed in collaboration with the Stuttgart State Opera. So you might have noticed that my background is slightly different, and you might recognize some of these images from the excerpt that we just saw. And this is the perfect cue to welcome Lucas. Hi, Lucas. I think you're muted still.
No, I'm here. Hi.
Hi. We share the same background, or in a different time zone, but also the same virtual 3D. So thank you for joining us and for accepting the invitation. And tell us a bit more about the project Solastalgia, and in what ways does the original root of the word and of the concept plays into the concept of the film.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bruno, for inviting me to this event, and also thanks a lot to Glenn for giving this wonderful lecture. It's a bit strange to now dive back into the negative after such an enthusiastic invitation to join the Symbiocene. And but I will explain a little bit about the film, because now we just saw some fragments. The film was shot right after the first weeks of lockdown in Central Europe, and it is set at an airport, the airport of Stuttgart, which was empty at the time. This moment of suspense, which was and still is a moment of distress, but also of pause and reflection for many on a personal level, also gave time to focus on systemic questions and on the fragility of the dynamics we've gotten used to. So with Bruno Latour's Où atterrir, where to land, after forming an awareness of the human role in and towards Earth, became one of the driving forces for the movie, but also the shock of the pandemic, for which in scale and impact, Glenn was talking about other examples, but in scale and impact, our generations have not yet had a direct experiential example. In earlier centuries, pandemics like the plague or cholera occurred periodically in bigger cities every 30 years, and in trading hubs, the threat was ever present. Consequently, the first measurements to fight and contain outbreaks, like statistics, quarantine, and the supervision through health authorities, were introduced systematically in cities like Venice in the beginning of the 17th century. And the two musical excerpts of the film feature madrigals written in the Trade Republic of Venice at that time: Si dolce e tormento by Carlo Milanuzzi and Oime dove il mio ben by Claudio Monteverdi, which are performed by singers and instrumentalists of the Stuttgart State Opera or freelance musicians. Monteverdi himself lost a son to the plague, which motivated him to become a pastor at later times. The madrigals, however, are secular pieces exemplifying the sorrow of an unfulfilled longing or the solitude of subordinating companionship to a higher duty. The film shows two narratives based on these emotional trajectories, which among other things draw motive inspirations from the fictionalization of pandemics in films. In the middle part, the philosopher and artist Fahim Amir, who was able to invite to write a text for the work, delivers a speech reflecting on the depictions of apocalypses and the personal realities of loss, historical and current political scopes of disease, travel, and what we want to be able to call a home. Now, choosing Glenn's term solastalgia as this project's title proved to not only bring a crucial connotation to the spaces visited by the film and the activities within it, both in fiction and reality, it also linguistically and effectively bridges the different time scopes that are at play. It's a neologism identifying a topic of current urgency while evoking a feeling of long and deep familiarity through the use of Greek, Latin, and New Latin roots. Basic substrates of a elaborate Western language. Solastalgia could also be the name of one of the madrigals. The concept behind solastalgia of solace and desolation and of course pain resonates with the contents and the affective dimensions of this music written in the 17th century. Both propose and induce a sort of unity in distress, seeking relief through and shared emotional understanding. And of course, Glenn referred to it as a bumper sticker definition. Homesickness you have when you're still at home, and the airport as a facilitator for an Earth, or the Earth within our reach, proved to be one of the basis for writing the script. And the question of home was also, of course, one of the vanishing points, vanishing lines for Fahim Amir's speech response.
Great. And can we have a bit more information on this background and the many elements that inhabit this virtual natural environment? I'm sure it doesn't look that much like the Symbiocene in my head, but I want to know more about it.
Yeah, so this, the background, which was also Fahim Amir's background on the flight schedule and advertising displays at the airport, in which we are having now in 2 different time zones, was a way for me to integrate the relationship between the economies and ecology, science and speculation. In the film, one of the protagonists designs the world and puts it on the screens. It seems to be her duty. It's connected to this topic of the second madrigal, but it's also unclear what interest lies behind it. There's 2 different options, of course. We are seeing silver snakes floating around through an artificial forest environment. Their trajectories follow the decaying stock values of companies invested in aviation, in the aviation sector, whose acronyms are also visible. And charlatans use to cover their pills in gold or silver to give their medicine a transcendent aura. The miracle drug, Terek, which was described by Fahim, included the meat of snakes as well. And there are penguins, non-flying birds, or as Glenn pointed out earlier, they can fly underwater. I'm watching the suspended reptiles. In the later segment, daisies change from white to black, a reference to the daisy world model by James Lovelock, who together with Lynn Margulis, who was already mentioned, introduced the Gaia hypothesis. Daisy World was a computer simulation illustrating the plausibility of the hypothesis through a simple planet populated by white and black daisies, which are either reflecting or absorbing sunlight adaptively to maintain a constant surface temperature. There's even a computer game based on the Daisy World model called Sim Earth, for which James Lovelock wrote an introduction, and that's one of the reasons I chose to work with a game engine to build the artificial world as a screen in the screen in the airport.
Thank you so much. I want to go back to the speech that we hear artist philosopher Fahim Amir proclaim in the departure boards and television screens in the airport. There we can definitely see, some ideas that are completely related to the notion of solastalgia. So this feeling of homesickness and the longing of a destination that is yet not there. And I particularly like the final statement when he quotes a statement from Antonio Gramsci, and I quote something like, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." So throughout the Earth Emotions book, Len, you mentioned many of the contemporary monsters of the anthropocene. And we, for the past decades, have been witnessing many initiatives that show that there is indeed a discontent with the current social, political, and economic systems that we have now. With the COVID situation, as you mentioned in your presentation, it feels like there is a new set of elements in the equation. So on the one hand, I think COVID made tangible, at least for my generation and for younger generations that didn't live any pandemic before like this at a global scale, that civilization breakdown is indeed connected to environmental breakdown, which is of course something that we've been warned a long time ago, but now has become tangible in our daily routines and in our daily lives. And on the other hand, there is this dimension of the virus that implies a different understanding of what individuality is and what self-identity is, because you're somehow made aware that your body is a community of organisms that are not only self-regulating and internally regulating your cognitive processes and your physical processes, but they are also at the mercy of external organisms in the environment. So indeed, I think it also became tangible that our necessity to engage with our natural environment in a different way is also a necessity to engage with the idea of self-identity and individuality in a different way. So going back to Gramsci's statement, a super powerful statement, I wanted to ask you, Glenn, if you think that if the mobilization that the COVID pandemic created in terms of the effect that it had globally and also individually in the sense of our understanding of our identities, do you think that provide us somehow a favorable circumstance to go beyond the time of the monsters?
Well, I certainly hope so. It's a pity that we've had to have the stimulus, the catalyst of a global pandemic that has killed so many people already, to begin to think about this intimate relationship that the human body has with the rest of life. Clearly, the science, the revolutionary science of symbiosis helps us understand that independently of disease and death. But if it takes more than just facts to move people, then you would hope that this pandemic has a massive emotional impact as well. I think it's delivering grief to humanity in a way that is direct and powerful, as opposed to something like climate change, which, although equally powerful, is slow poison. It's chronic. People can almost ignore it, but you can't ignore what's going on with the COVID pandemic. I think it also awakens a kind of revolutionary political perspective as well. I've renamed one of the big viruses on Earth Capit 20, which is capitalism and the way it operates in the 20th century. So we have COVID-19 and we have Capit-20. And as a result, I feel that we're beginning to see that we are enmeshed in a cancerous and dysbiotic, disease-producing economic and political system, which is being played out in front of our very eyes very rapidly. And so I would hope that the critical evaluation of COVID-19 and it's causing us to reevaluate our identity. We are not who we thought we were. We're not isolated atoms. We're not heroic individuals. We're not superheroes. We are kept alive by trillions of other tiny little organisms, some of which are our friends, that ward off those who are our enemies. Life is a cooperative enterprise. And I think we're beginning to understand in a more global form that particular view of life. But it challenges just about everything that we felt in the past about our specialness, our uniqueness, our superiority. We are in fact made of the same stuff and share the same life as every other life form on this planet. Capit-20 is a serious pandemic. Its influence is now enormous and dangerous. We have to come to grips with that pandemic as well as COVID-19.
I want to ask you to elaborate a little bit more about two concepts that I became aware of while reading your book, which are soliphilia and symbiocracy. So somehow the combination of the two would give us modes of governance that could go beyond these dichotomies of left and right and socialist and capitalist. So if you could elaborate a bit more on the two concepts, and then I'm also curious to know if you see any social or political movements that are going in that direction today, and how, what is their agency towards our deep-seated political structures of today?
Right. So simple to answer those questions. I've always thought that solidarity was a wonderful word, and I guess I'm steeped in the philosophy of the left. I wrote my PhD on the organic theories of Karl Marx, and so I understand solidarity in English as a word that is exactly what I think humanity needs at a time of crisis, to work with each other to solve things. But I'm also aware that the world is divided on ideological grounds, no better illustrated than in the disunited States of America at the moment. So as a result, I thought we need a word which is independent of ideology, at least the standard left-right divide in politics and economics, that encourages people to think that by working with others is actually the way of solving many of our problems. So the solophilia, the soli in solophilia, is about this engagement with others. It's the solidarity of politics without the ideology. And so community groups that are working at local level, through regional level, and even now international levels, I thought the concept of solophilia would be a useful addition to our language. And I did indeed, you know, even within Australia, we see community solophilia fighting, for example, the death of or the destruction of habitat for koalas in my local area. People that don't normally speak to each other or work together because they have different political allegiances, different religious and other beliefs, all of a sudden come together and fight for a common cause. And that to me is the inherent solophilia in people, the love of working together to solve common problems. In a sense, it was a precursor to the concept of the Symbiocene, because I wanted something bigger than just merely the desire to work with other people. I wanted to create something towards which solophilia can build. And so I think those two concepts together will help. Symbiocracy is just simply to try and remind people that democracy comes from the Greek demos, of the people. It's an inherently anthropocentric concept. It deals with how humans manage humans, and that symbiocracy rule for the totality, the relationships between the human and the non-human, is where we have to go in the future. So it's there, like many of my concepts, I don't necessarily need it to be adopted into the language, but what we need to do is to confront it. And it causes, hopefully, within somebody who reads it, who looks at it, who then begins to think about, well, what's wrong with democracy? Why can't we just make democracy more or better or more effective? It's to begin to remind people that democracy has its origins in the government of people, and that one of the big shifts in consciousness in the late 20th, early 21st century is the realization through our work on symbiosis and the microbiome, and Simard's work on the mycorrhizae that interconnect fungi and tree roots. All of these things are telling us that the non-human is incredibly important, to put it mildly, and that for humans to think that all we have to do is improve our own governance of ourselves improve democracy is insufficient. Symbiocracy is a recognition that to govern ourselves, we must include the non-human in all of our deliberations. And so it's rule for the earth, by the earth, for the earth. It's a different way of conceptualizing governance. And it's for everyone. There aren't experts that can rule via symbiocracy for us all. It needs to be citizen-based, it needs to be indigenous-based, it needs to be the young, the wisdom of the learners, I called it in an article I wrote recently. And it has to be the wisdom of the learners, because we're now in a position where the world can't return to a past state. We have to create something which has the same features, properties, and characteristics, but is not a return to the past. And this is where the role of creativity, particularly creative art and artists, have a critical role to play in this movement out of the despair of the Anthropocene and into the joy and beauty of the Symbiocene.
And what fascinates me also with the words and the neologisms and the concepts that you create is that it's beyond, it's actually not descriptive, it's prefigurative. And I think this, the prefiguration of a reality that's not yet here, but that somehow starts to get an outline through this process of prefiguration through language or through artworks, something that is completely necessary, and which is also connected to this idea of that I feel that the concepts that I mentioned before, soliphilia and symbiocracy, have deeply embedded in them this idea of inter and intra-generational stewardship, equity, and biodiversity, of course, but they are something that is projecting time forward, or it's meant to foster the future generations in a way. And while reading your book, I thought it was really interesting to see how you describe Aboriginal Australians and their culture, and how this holistic and complete conception of human culture within nature and vice versa, and this material and symbolic kinship that humans have with non-human agents and entities, created in the past kind of a proto-Symbiocene. So in the past, we already had that sort of prefiguration from the Aboriginal communities of a desirable future to come that we're now kind of hoping for. But at the same time, you also mentioned in your book that we can also look at the experience of Aboriginal Australians as something that is also showing what our future can look like, especially in terms of this emotional loss and this extinction that was caused by these colonial forces. And I was reading Roman Krznarik's book, The Good Ancestor, and there, I would like to read a quote and bring it to discussion, because I think it ties beautifully with this description that you make of Aboriginal cultures in Australia. So I quote Roman: "The moment has come, especially for those living in wealthy nations, to recognize a disturbing truth, that we have colonized the future. We treat the future like a distant colonial outpost, devoid of people, where we can freely dump ecological degradation, technological risk, and nuclear waste, in which we can plunder as we please. When Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th century, it drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, nobody's land, to justify its conquest and to treat the indigenous populations as if they didn't exist or have any claims on the land. Today, our societal attitude is one of tempus nullius. The future is seen as nobody's time, an unclaimed territory that is similarly devoid of inhabitants. Like the distant realms of empire, it is ours for the taking. just as Indigenous Australians still struggle against the legacy of terra nullius, so too there is a struggle to be had against the doctrine of tempus nullius, end of quote. And especially now that I'm talking to you in the future, because you're in Friday morning and we in the Netherlands are in Thursday evening, I wanted to ask you, and having in consideration that, I've put a lot in the table, intergenerational stewardship, Aboriginal cultures, so on and so forth. Does going in the Symbiocene entail a radically different conception of time to start with?
Yes, I think this idea of tempus nullius is brilliant. It's exactly mirrors the thinking that I've had about how the adults of the present have colonized the future. I mentioned that with respect to Greta Thunberg. People who have no stake in the present, who are not able to see a place for themselves in the society that we now describe under the term of the Anthropocene, also can't see a place for themselves in the future if business as usual proceeds. So this idea of the theft of the future, the Australian writer Tim Flannery described it as future eating. It's the same theme, and it's been presented by many thinkers now that even within the sustainability literature under the title of intergenerational equity, that this is something which is clearly unjust, clearly unethical, and is, in a sense, a complete insult to our own children. And yet the reason why so many adults are working so hard, worrying about their finances, their wealth, their superannuation, etc., is to give their children a good life. So we're now living a contradiction which is so powerful that it must be laughed at by the indigenous people of the earth who have already been through terra nullius, where they were seen as occupying a space that needed to be defined and occupied and ruled by superior Europeans, as opposed to a place which was culturally constructed meaning. And that distinction between a space and a place is at the heart of the colonial mind. We need, Barry Lopez wrote about that in his book Arctic Dreams, and it's a very important point, that this idea of place is central to my work. It's this the effort of putting a cultural meaning into the relationship between humans and the environment in particular that I'm interested in. And Australian Aboriginal people have been here for perhaps longer than just about any other continuously occupying group of humans on the planet. We're now looking at somewhere between 80 and 100,000 years of continuous occupation of Terra Australis. However, I think they too struggle with what's happening now. And I've noted that Aboriginal artists are beginning to use the term solastalgia to describe their own experience of the desolation of their time and their place. So the coming together of time and place, the terra tempus nullius and the terra nullius, is for Indigenous people the world over a massively powerful experience. And all I can say is, and I don't write or speak for them, is that their courage and their intellectual and physical bravery in the face of all of that is quite incredible. And I admire greatly their resolve and their strength to continue fighting for their identity, their places. So I think we're seeing the coming together of a whole range of ideas, the colonizing in the past, colonizing the future, negating meaning in anything other than the European and now capitalist forms of thinking and meaning, they will crumble because the edifice that they've built is also crumbling. And so I don't wish for the apocalypse to fall down on us to change. I argued earlier that as Homo sapiens, we're supposed to be intelligent enough to see the future, avoid it if it's taking us into the apocalypse, and embracing it if it's taking us into the Symbiocene. And so as an intelligent species, I hope that we're more intelligent than the people who currently occupy the United States of America.
I hope that's it. I'd like to bring some questions online to the discussion. Lucas, also, if you have a question for Glenn, or Glenn, if you have a question for Lucas, feel free to interrupt me at any time and ask the question or comment. But if you allow me, I would like to start by a question by Savage Pueras. He's one of the participants here at the Jan van Eyck, and he asked, how can one imagine a Symbiocene in a world where humans are incapable of living in peace with each other?
Well, just the knowledge that we are capable of living in peace with each other. It's not logically or practically impossible for us to do that. And perhaps we have done so for the greater part of our evolutionary and cultural history. We are aggressive, we are warlike, but if we were only like that, we would have disappeared already from the face of the earth. It's, the ability to cooperate, mutual aid is also a characteristic of being human. The balance between those two is always difficult to pinpoint. Right now, your questioner is right. We're living at times where it seems as if what I call the terraforans, earth destroyers, are on the ascendancy. But at the same time as they are doing their bad work, we are seeing, through Extinction Rebellion, through Greta, through hundreds of thousands of small groups of people working in soliphilia with each other, resistance to the extinction of our biological world. And I've had to invent another word which I call muicide, which is the extinction of our emotions. We have to resist precisely the attempt to say that we can't think our way, feel our way out of the dilemma that we're in. So I can only offer the kind of logic that says evils fight evils. They also fight goods, but because evils also fight each other, they don't have the same persistence that goods have when they work together to defeat evil. And so I'll leave you with that conundrum. If evil prevailed, we wouldn't be here talking about the problems of the earth right now.
Thank you, Glenn. Tie up to that question, there's another one from Arvid and Marie, also participants here at the Jan van Eyck, and they have written, "Thanks, Glenn, for the inspiring presentation. I was wondering that when moving to a Symbiocene, you are talking about working with other organisms, like fungi or bacteria. What might be ways of avoiding an exploitative relationship with these organisms, as we have with the domesticated animals that we have built a big part of our food culture on? Additionally, I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on achieving a Symbiocene in an overpopulated world."
Right. Well, exploitation is a difficult concept. For life to exist, it lives on life. And that's a universal truth, that everything eats everything else. Everything consumes the waste products of other things. So the notion of exploitation becomes ethically important when, in addition to the essential property of consuming life to have life, we create things like, you know, the mass production of food through, for example, feedlots. The deliberate infliction of pain and distress on sentient creatures is a form of exploitation that has profound ethical implications, and one that's been followed up by many writers and thinkers the world over. To think that fungi building themselves in the shape of bricks could be a form of exploitation, I think is pushing the concept of exploitation too far. It's an interesting dilemma, but the idea of the Symbiocene as a geological era involves a vision of the future where what humans produce leaves nothing on the face of the earth. There is no residue, no toxic waste. There is only what I call a biofilm or a symbiofilm left on the surface of the earth to indicate that we have used entirely the products of other life in order to achieve what it is that we need to be as human. So there will in fact be geological proof of the Symbiocene. It's when this wonderfully rich humus covers the toxic, cancerous mess that the Anthropocene is laying down right now. And so I don't see the Symbiocene as built on the kind of exploitation that we have under the Anthropocene, where we deliberately create systems of pain, distress, and then try to ignore that in the form of, a feedlot beef packaged in polystyrene and plastic wrapping sitting in a supermarket. I've criticised that in my own work, and I fully support others who do so. So I hope that explains the exploitation aspect of it. And now you'll have to remind me if there was another dimension that you want me to talk about.
Yes, about the thoughts of achieving a Symbiocene in an overpopulated world. But
right. So the relationship between population and consumption is discussed by many authors. I see our current form of the consumption being perhaps the greater of the two problems, not the actual numbers of human beings. I'm sure that's controversial, and I'm willing to defend it further if I had the time to do so. Changing the way we consume from cancerous exploitation to the sorts of ideas that I presented as possible in the Symbiocene is something that I think is possible and obviously desirable. Humans can choose in a Symbiocene world as to whether or not they have children, how many children they have. But clearly, if we are Homo sapiens, then humans reproducing at replacement level, 2 children per couple, is rational. Those who choose not to have children will certainly bring the level of population down to below replacement. We're currently on track for a much lower rate of population increase than we thought we would have 10, 20, 50 years ago. So it's no longer exponentially increasing. So rather than talk about, active forms of population control, which I think can lead to all sorts of very undesirable and nasty consequences, I think we can do this by addressing the huge problem of toxic and cancerous consumption that we have now, and letting human beings who are intelligent enough to sort out their birth rates and population levels to do that themselves. I address it briefly in Earth Emotions, the book. It's certainly something that I must apply more thinking to, but it's an issue, and I'm glad that people are aware that population is something that we have to seriously consider.
I'm getting a lot of questions online, so thank you for all of those that are participating in the conversation. I hope I can manage all of them in the short time that we have, so I'll have to make some choices. There's a question from Christoph Miller, one of the participants too. I'll read it out. Hi Glenn, thanks for the great talk. The concept of Symbiocene seems fascinating to me, but I wonder how you connect the idea of the symbiosis to more systemic questions within late capitalism. For example, could it work or evolve in a neoliberal market economy and or the current social political climate in the West? Or is it an underlying hope that a symbolic revolution would change the system from within? And if so, into which political, economical direction?
It's a big question. I think my answer briefly is that neoliberalism is founded on the concept of the individual, the atomistic underpinnings of neoliberalism are quite clear. It's connected to the notion of individual rights operating within a marketplace where rights are protected by the state. So the right to own property, to enclose the commons has been characteristic of capitalism, and now it's neoliberal and neoconservative forms in the early 21st century. No better illustrated than, say, in the United States of America, where even the idea of the rights of nature can be trumped, if I could use that word, by corporations that have personhood and express on which we are currently trying to muddle our way through the anthropocene that needs to be replaced. I can only encourage you to think that if you can see that the Symbiocene is a better model to think about than neoliberalism and neoconservative atomism, then you're already in the Symbiocene, and that you can stop worrying about how to fix a broken system and start creatively putting together, putting into place and working in soliphilia with other people, the details of the Symbiocene. I'm just a 67-year-old man sitting in front of a computer at Wallaby Farm in Duns Creek in New South Wales. I'll do whatever I can, but I need help. So this thing is a big idea, and if you can see that it has merit, given that it supports life rather than the death of the Anthropocene, then I encourage you to accept your membership of the Symbiocene and just get stuck into it yourself.
Great. I'm going to merge two questions that are roughly about the same thing, from the Soft Protest Digest and Asha Kahami. To which extent would spirituality and getting in touch with human consciousness have a role to play in the switch to the Symbiocene? And Asha is also curious about other ways beyond intellectual knowledge, like meditation practice, shamanic practices, or psychedelics, for example. So,
well, as a former hippie, I can say that, yeah, some of those later ideas I fully supported as a young man. As an older philosopher, I do take the idea of spirituality very seriously, but I have written about it in the book Earth Emotions as a form of secular spirituality. I feel it when I live on this property in Australia, that I'm walking on lands owned by the Wonnarua people. I'm also walking on land that's been occupied by creatures such as the wallabies and the koalas for millions of years. There is a connection to life which goes across time. And I thought it's strange that we don't even have a word for that in our language, a secular word for spirituality that connects our individual life force with that of life forces of the present and the distant past. So I created one. I call it the Gedeist. Ged is an old Indo-European word meaning to gather, to bring together, to good, not meaning, but it's connected to all of those words. It's part of their origin. and the Geist is the spirit of the Germanic languages. So Geist is my way of talking about a secular spirituality, which in line with the science, in line with the economics, in line with the ethics, is an integral part of what I would see as the Symbiocene. So I write about the Geist as a spiritual force, purely to allow people who are struggling with the failure of existing domains of spirituality, like the church. The formal churches have really struggled with the whole idea of environmentalism, climate change in the future. Amazing leadership under the current Pope, but of course the Catholic Church is not entirely supportive of many aspects of what I would call the Symbiocene, particularly population control and population issues. So I think there is a role for spirituality. I have taken it seriously enough to write a chapter about it in the book. I see it as an entirely naturalistic, earth-bound spirituality, which is precisely the basis of many of the spiritual traditions of other cultures on earth. As for meditation, yoga, and all the other things, it's like if it works for you, do it. I just need to be able to walk in places where I can absorb, as I said, this deep time and deep space, feeling that my connection to the rest of life is a primordial and powerful one, one that I'd love to share with others as often as I can. And I think that there is communion in that. I talk now about, instead of solitude, I created the term symbiotude, which is the exact opposite of solitude, to try and feel the spirituality in company with others, to educate others, to be open to it. And if you can do that, then I think you're doing good in this world, and whatever way you can achieve it, I take my hat off to you if I was wearing one.
Thank you very much. One more question, is that okay, Glenn?
Yeah.
I have lots of interesting questions. There's one from Felix Calmenson. Thanks for the fascinating presentation. I was wondering how we can take account for and define our role in instantiating a mass extinction event, and what could a truth and reconciliation process look like? Thinking of this in parallel to the processes in Canada with genocide of Indigenous people.
So could you repeat that for me, please? Because I lost track of it just for a moment.
It's a complex question. So Felix is wondering, how can we take account for and define our role in instantiating a mass extinction event, and what could a truth and reconciliation process look like? Thinking of this in parallel, such as the process of genocide of Indigenous people in Canada.
Right. So to stop a mass extinction event, I mean, this is the dilemma faced by activists all over the world, and Extinction Rebellion would be the obvious example of a group of humans of many different generations who've come together to stop what is obviously the path to extinction that many humans are on right now. The same path can be taken to deal with the I guess the extinction of other cultures, the extinction of other languages. The issue of extinction goes across so many different dimensions. I can only speak with some confidence about the extinction of emotions. As I said, I call it muicide. Our emotional strength, our ability to deal with those that wish to destroy us, is a hugely testing and a hugely, anxiety-producing feeling in me right now. And I can appreciate how in other peoples, particularly indigenous peoples who have been through all this once before, at least once before, and are now experiencing it as a second wave. I can only encourage people to see the strength of the resistance in indigenous people all over the world to not only their extinction physically, but the extinction of their culture, their language, their future. And so it is an issue of resistance. It's an issue of politics. In my book, I've said that it's such a critical juncture in our history that we may as well declare World War III, which I describe as a war of the emotions. So it's a non-violent declaration. I don't wish us to suddenly start to bear arms and start killing one another. But this emotional conflict between those forces that wish to destroy and those that wish to create, I call them terra nascent people, earth creators, terra the earth, nascent, to give birth to. The terra nascients amongst us have to work together. That's the Solastalgia. They're working together to produce something for the future, which I call the Symbiocene. The way that plays out is incredibly difficult for me to give detail on. It's activism in all of its forms. It's hacktivism. It's everything that we can do to bring down the current state of affairs. That earlier point about neoliberalism, the symbols of it, you know, the leaders of our so-called free societies right now, and they're being voted in by people that are not yet ready for the Symbiocene. But I would hope that from my work and from others tackling this idea of the I guess we would call it the tempus nullius of the future, that's one of the things that I think where ideas, concepts can be powerful, and I hope more powerful than violence and guns. If guns are used, then it's a bit like the same issue that frightened me as a young adult with mutually assured destruction, or MAD, under the threat of nuclear annihilation. That future was so impossible to contemplate that it's actually produced a degree of peace. We've now got a new version of MAD that we're all engaged in. Mutually assured destruction is something that won't be achieved, I hope, because we will resist it, and it's being resisted in a multitude of ways by people all over the earth. That has to go global, and it also has to be intensely local. I start here in Duns Creek in New South Wales. I can only encourage people to start from wherever they are and build and collaborate with others in Solastalgia to bring about change. And that change has a direction, and that destination is the Symbiocene. And I'm reminded of the famous old Chinese proverb, which is that, you know, if we don't change direction soon, we'll get where we're going. I don't want to get to the end of the Anthropocene because I know what it looks like, and it's a place where I don't wish to exist, and I don't want my children or grandchildren to end up there. And so I want change now, and I know where to go. It's a different direction. And I think artists and creative people can see that as clearly as the philosophers or other thinkers. We just need the intellectual and I guess personal courage to take this path in a different direction.
Another question from YouTube. Does the idea of Symbiocene demand technological disarmament? How could we maintain or even advance our technological level without simultaneously exploiting our environment and its resources?
It's a good question, and I plead the case of a philosopher who's struggling to see the technological and engineering requirements of a future that is to be created and yet doesn't exist right now. Again, it's part of the exercise of being a Homo sapien. How do we intelligently create an emergent hybrid culture that uses life to support human life in a way that's not destructive, exploitative, and ultimately self-defeating. Now, I would rather die trying to achieve that end than just simply say that, look, we're bound to fail. The optimist in me says that it would be fantastic for humanity to have a go at this, to try, rather than either give up and go back to the idea that the atavism of the cave, that we just simply can't survive without exploiting and destroying the rest of life, or that we attempt to create this emergent hybrid future where we connect to structures, systems that are already in place in nature. So it's no cyborg future. It's a future whereby we exist with microbes, fungi, bacteria. We exist with the energy that plants produce. We use the compost, the humus, to build soil, to improve our ability to practice agriculture. These are essentially human characteristics. That's what I think humans are good at. We've just been really dumb in the past because we've disconnected ourselves from the rest of nature, mainly via technologies that are exploitative of the earth, polluting of the earth, and ultimately destructive of humans. So it's, for me, a very simple solution. Let's work hard and use our intelligence and creativity to create a desirable future. As a philosopher, I've given you the outline. If you're an artist, an engineer, a designer, a lawyer, any other kind of person, it's up to you to start creating the details of your dimension of the Symbiocene. And that should be exciting and interesting. It should be challenging. It's never-ending work. You'll never be bored. There'll be no time for gambling. You know, it's probably no time for gaming either. It's time for humans to reconnect with life, and that's there'll be no unemployment in such a mood or mentality. We've got lots to do.
It's really evident, I think, that your concepts and your neologisms have had amazing influence, not only in academia and even in legal context, but also in the arts. So my question to you now is, how have the arts shaped the way you shaped these concepts?
It's a challenging question, that one, because I mean, I'm now a mature man and I've had a lifetime of experience absorbing art in all of its forms, music in all of its wonderful forms as well. And, you know, I loved Lucas's film for its bringing together of some of the best in music with the demands of the present and the impact of the pandemic. So I feel as if my whole life has been an exercise in symbiosis, where parts of me are created or constructed through art. But I did have a revelation when I first saw the art of the Austrian artist Hundertwasser, who I guess you would call it organic art, in the sense that he saw the straight line as one of the defining characteristics of where humans have gone wrong in the modern age. He didn't call it the anthropocene, but he saw the straight line and the box as symbolic of a kind of closed mind that was incapable of creatively engaging with the earth. So his architecture and his art, his design, displayed the fluidity, the organic form of life. And if you get to look at Hundertwasser's art, or go to Vienna and have a look at some of the buildings that have been constructed based on his ideas, you'll see what I mean. You know, somebody who was radical enough to think that you could build buildings that had tree tenants, somebody who was radical enough to see that the relationship between the subterranean and the the building and the air via plants, roots, and all the rest of it was way ahead of most other people who were thinking about these things at the time. So his art, his design was a huge inspiration for me to think organically about the relationship between well, philosophy and the meaning of life, and then its flow into more practical things like architecture. But I wrote a PhD thesis on organic philosophy in Western culture. So Hundertwasser was probably one of the main inspirations for thinking organically about life, and it continues to inspire me. And obviously the surrealists are also somehow deeply embedded in my concept of solastalgia. Salvador Dali and others that depicted reality falling apart in ways that defied ordinary logic were early illustrations of the collapse of the anthropocene and the emotional impact that has. And so I'm now influenced by artists who are responding to my own work. And so, you know, every year now the world over, there are many artists who are presenting exhibitions based on solastalgia or solophilia or other concepts. And so I'm now learning from them as to how to push my own ideas further or take them into places where I never thought they were possible, where it was possible for them to live. So despite the fact that I'm now an aging hippie, I'm actually still in the exciting process of learning from young people in particular who are creative and are taking ideas into new dimensions. So my life has been influenced by art. I singled out Hundertwasser because he was such a radical dude, you know. He just didn't do things in the way that everyone else expected the world to be. But there were perhaps many others, and all I can say is that whatever I am, I'm the sum or the cumulative total of the art, the music, the dance, and all the other creative endeavors that humans have put together in the past. I guess that means I'm both complex and confused. I'm never actually fixed in my identity. And so if we can end my own contribution to the theme of identity, right now it's that I have an emergent identity. I hope it continues to emerge until the day I fall off my perch.
Well, I'm sure it will. I think that's the perfect ending for our conversation today. We still have more questions online, but unfortunately we have run out of time for now. But I would advise you to read Glenn's book and to keep following his posts in Psychoteoretica, your blog, Glenn. And I would like to thank you, Glenn, for the time and for the generosity of sharing such an amazing work and such an inspiring attitude towards the future. Thank you so much for your time and availability. Have a nice rest of the day there in Australia. Thank you so much also, Lucas, for joining us and sharing excerpts of the movie that will premiere later in the year if everything goes well. Thank you very much, Lucas. And thank you very much also to Hisham Khalidi, the director of the Jan van Eyck Academy, for the introduction. I hope he's still watching us online. And thank you all for the amazing questions online. I'm sorry that I couldn't address them all, but the conversation for me was really amazing, and I'm looking forward for the next occasion to chat with Glenn and with you all, maybe in the Symbiocene in the near future, hopefully. Thank you also for the team of the Jan van Eyck that made this possible and that worked with me in Glenn and Lucas. And that's it. See you next time. Thank you very much.